Hello everyone, amateur meteorologist. First weather here. It is October 7th, 2020, and we have Hurricane Delta now. Uh, Another major hurricane, which is part of a very active season we've been having. It's the earliest or strongest Greek letter hurricane to ever form. Just goes to show how unique this season has been. As you can see, we have lots of very strong convection indicated by those pink cloud tops, really showing that very elevated and high cloud tops, indicating the strength in the storm and just overall the sheer magnitude of its power. This isn't necessarily the most organized storm. It definitely does look a bit more organized than from a few hours ago. You can see some of this banding right here, and then these inflow winds coming in this way in a more distinct ovular shape. Definitely more distinct than it was just even 12 hours ago. Luckily, though, it has weakened just a bit. This is the latest 10 p.m. advisory. Forecast advisory 14. You can see it's moving west-northwest at 17 miles per hour. It is currently a Category 2 hurricane with sustained winds at 90 miles per hour. And it is expected actually to strengthen back into major hurricane strength before weakening as it makes landfall. Landfall is expected sometime around Friday evening, 7 p.m. And then by 7 p.m. Sunday, we should already be in the Kentucky region as a very diminished tropical depression. And by then, the main threat will just be some pretty heavy rain and maybe some occasional gusty winds upwards of 20 to 30 miles per hour. So this system will luckily de-intensify or weaken pretty quickly once it does make landfall. But it does look like this will be, once again, directly hitting the Gulf states of Louisiana and also eastern Texas before moving back up to the northeast. You can see that the wind field extent for the hurricane wind field extent is not too big right now, which is good news, but that I do predict and I do expect that will intensify as the system does get its act together. And as it weakens before coast, sometimes what you do see is with weakening hurricanes, the peak sustained winds might weaken, but the overall wind field can sometimes expand. So the overall damaging wind field of 75 miles per hour sustained winds or higher can sometimes increase by 25, 50, maybe even 75 miles as that system does weaken. And then you can see the tropical storm wind field is pretty healthy, a nice symmetrical circle around the storm, indicating proper structure and integrity of the storm. Now, switching gears, here is the ensemble guidance for Delta. You can see that what we've been lacking over the past few days is really consistent model output. You had many models actually taking the system, some taking it over here, then making that turn, some making that turn much earlier, impacting maybe even Mississippi and eastern portions of Louisiana. But now, luckily, we have seen that agreement relatively come into shape. We still do have one outlier here, but those outliers were actually all the way 100 miles to the east before. So it's definitely good news to see some sort of agreement come into the models that this will make landfall most likely in the central portion of Louisiana, if not 25 miles west or east, which is typical as you have those eyewall rotations, but it does look quite likely at this point that we will be having landfall basically in the dead middle of the state of Louisiana. Now here's the intensity forecast. Right now, we are at a weak Category 2 hurricane, if not a strong Category 1. And most of the models do, in fact, take it back up to Category 3, a couple even Category 2, a couple even Category 3. I expect this to actually shift a bit upwards. I think there is a good chance we will reach Category 3 strength once again, as it does have those open Gulf waters, and it still does have claim to some pretty good ocean heat content before it makes landfall. But then you can see after that, all the models agree, a very dramatic and sudden drop in intensity as soon as it really gets closer to the coast, and I'll discuss why in a little bit. Now here's the GFS model. This is the 18Z run, valid as of 18Z October 7th, and valid for 0Z October 10th. So this is around 8 p.m. Friday, just when the National Weather Service is forecasting landfall. You can see the GFS has a pressure of 973 millibars. I want you to ignore that because these operational models aren't really that good with intensity. What I want you to take into notice or really take from this picture is the location. The GFS has this just west of central Louisiana, And then when you compare that to the European, you can see it's pretty much the exact same thing. So that's another encouraging sign with both major operational global weather models in agreement that the system will make landfall somewhere in central Louisiana. That is definitely good news. And just goes to increase the confidence that this will make landfall in that region. Now, here is the GFS upper level wind stream for 250 millibar wind stream lines, and you can see very nice, very strong anticyclonic high around the system right here, and that will help to sort of push away that shear. But what I do want you to notice is that shear isn't intruding from the right or from the east. That shear is this sort of little mini trough in the western part to the west of Delta, and it's going to be an intricate game, like I said in my last video, as to when that trough interacts with the system. And according to this particular run, Delta should stay pretty relatively shear free up until it's just about 50 to 100 miles off the coast. And that's what, according to the GFS, that's when this little jet streak and little trough right here, a weak disturbance, will start to interact with the system. So I think about 12 hours before landfall, Delta will start to experience some pretty substantial, not substantial, but a noticeable shear, which is in direct contrast to what it's been experiencing over the past 24 hours and will continue to experience for the next 24 hours or so. So that definitely will help, I think, to prevent any rapid reintensification or intensification before landfall. That's a worrisome trend we've seen this season with most systems intensifying right up until landfall. Usually you don't really have that. Unfortunately, this season the luck has not really been in that department. So definitely a good sign to see that shear really starting to intensify and increase right before landfall. Now here's the 400 to 700 millibar relative humidity. This is another important aspect into determining whether the system will be able to maintain its strength. The intrusion of any dry air will really choke off its ability to maintain its intensity. And like I was saying that before, that weak disturbance which will be coming through, it will be bringing some dry air behind it. And so as you can see, as it gets closer to landfall, when it starts interacting with that upper level shear, it's also going to start to pull in some of that dry air. And what that's going to do is, while it'll be too late for some of the winds or the strong winds to be weakened before it really impacts the coastline, the backside of the system will really start to weaken by the time we get into about 50 miles inland. So the good news with this regard is that many times with hurricanes, you have that extremely strong 1-2 punch where you have that first, the frontal quadrant, and then after that, you have the second quadrant, which oftentimes has even stronger winds and really causes the sort of final blow. It looks like in this scenario, with that very strong, or not very strong, but that disturbance coming in with that substantially dry air behind it, that dry air will start to suck into the system, really sort of choking off the southern half of the system, and that should help to lessen the severity of the backside of the storm. So coastal regions right here, that'll get the brunt of the impact. It looks like after about the first half of the storm passes by, the chance of the second quadrant or the lower southern quadrant of the storm being much stronger or packing the same punch is reduced, which is definitely a good sign. And furthermore, this also does support and help that this system will start to weaken right before landfall as that dry air slowly starts to get sucked into the system. Now, one other thing, look here. In the Caribbean, where Delta has been for the past few days, has been very warm. We're talking record ocean heat content. However, because of Lara and some other tropical systems, we actually have, for the first time in a while, below average, in many cases well below average, sea surface temperature anomalies in the Gulf of Mexico. And that's another thing. These very warm waters have really helped to maintain an intensified delta. But as it gets closer to that increased shear, that dry air coming in, and also those very cool waters, I think that, again, supports weakening with the system as it approaches the coast. Again, I cannot reiterate this enough. Even though Delta may be weakening, it will still be a very dangerous Category 2, potentially strong Category 1 hurricane when it makes landfall. That does not change the danger level. you many times have the same number, if not higher numbers of death with weaker systems because they're slower sometimes, they have more flooding, anything. So that doesn't really change the danger level. What it does change is the peak winds. And so that might help to reduce some of the wind damage we're going to see in areas that have already been ravaged by Lara. For example, I saw earlier today an image of an aerial image of just thousands of homes covered in blue tarps. And those same areas are expected to be directly hit by Delta in just a few days. So if the system would weaken, that would definitely be a big help in reducing some of the potential wind damage that might occur. Now, switching to some of the specifically designated hurricane models. Sometimes these models do get a bit of a bad reputation for really over-intensifying systems, but I do think they are important to look at because they can show good trends in strength and what can be expected. In the past few systems, the HWRF and some of the others have really done a good job in predicting the strength of each system. So this is the HWRF model valid for 60 Friday, October 9th. As we take this through time, you can see it actually strengthens this to a millibar pressure of 948 millibars. That's actually a very strong Category 4 hurricane. And look, this right here is Texas. This right here is Louisiana. What I do want you to take into account is as we get closer to landfall, look at that. By the time it's making landfall, it has a pressure of about 957 millibars. That's a strong Category 2 storm. So again, nothing to mess with, but it's much better than a stronger Category 4 hurricane. Same thing with the HMON. A pressure of 939 millibars, about 100 miles off the coast. But as we get closer to time, and keep in mind, this is a strong Category 4 hurricane, potentially Category 5, which I think is overdone. But by the time we get closer to the coast, at landfall, millibar pressure of 960 millibars, which again is a Category 2 hurricane, if not a strong Category 1. So we're going from a potential Category 4 all the way to a Category 1 hurricane in the span of just 12 to 24 hours, according to both of these models, which I think is some very encouraging news. Now, on top of the fact, with both of these models, in my opinion, overdoing the strength 100 miles off the coast, I think the system will intensify to a strong Cat 3 or weak Cat 4. I think it's very likely that we will see the system maybe make landfall as a strong Category 1, if not a weak Category 2. I think that definitely will help keep the system's strength in check with that dry air, with that encroaching wind shear just before landfall and those cool waters. What was previously looking like a major hurricane at landfall, I think, definitely could be a Category 1. And so while that won't protect from the heavy wind, from the heavy rain and the storm surge, the wind threat definitely will be a little lower. Now, finally, here's the GFS precip forecast. You can see that anywhere from 5 to maybe even 10 inches of rain in spots, especially where you have landfall or direct landfall. And what I do want you to notice is that areas in this black circle just got pounded by heavy rain from Lara just a few weeks ago. And so you're going to have about 5 to 10 more inches of rain over that same location. The risk of flooding, in my opinion, is very high this time around, even higher than Lara, which brought much higher rainfall totals. And that's because the ground is already very, very saturated. So on top of the winds, on top of the storm surge, you're going to be having some potentially catastrophic flooding in parts of central and western Louisiana by the time we reach Friday and Saturday. So again, this system is not something you want to mess with. Please heed your local officials and their instructions. While I think this system definitely will be weakening as it makes landfall, which is good news, this again is not something you want to mess with. So stay tuned. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.